Welcome to The Victory Kitchen, the podcast all about American food rationing during World War II. I'm your host, Sarah Creviston Lee, author, historian, and vintage foodie. I'll be exploring the logistics of food rationing, featuring wartime cookbooks and recipes, and highlighting real home front experiences. We're going to be learning exactly what our grandmothers had to do to get their food to fight for victory. Hi, welcome back to another episode of The Victory Kitchen. Today is episode number 5, and we're going to be talking all about meat rationing. Meat rationing is a multifaceted topic. We could talk about Spam, we could talk about meatless aspects of wartime like Meatless Mondays, but I'm going to be saving those topics for their own episodes. Today, I'll just be focusing on where the meat went, what exactly was rationed, and how the government got Americans to eat quote-unquote variety meats. Later on, I'll be talking about our featured cookbook, 120 Wartime Meat Recipes. And then finally, we've got our featured home front story for today. Before we dive into today's episode, I just wanted to take a second to talk about current events. How are things for you right now? In my neck of the woods here in North Central Maryland, some stores have been having things back in stock. One large grocery store near me has removed milk from the limit of 2. They even had ground beef and chicken back in stock, along with oodles of eggs and butter. I've even glimpsed toilet paper a time or two. It might have been the time of day I went. Usually at the end of the day, there's none to be had. So anyway, I hope things are getting better. Right now, our governor has just placed a ban on people leaving their homes starting tonight at 8. So this is Monday, March 30th. And you can just leave for essential stuff like medical and food. So yeah, things are progressing. But I just wanted to give a huge shout out to all the employees of grocery stores and restaurants that keep going into work so that our communities can be fed during this crisis. All right, so diving into the stuff we have to talk about today. You know, several times in my wartime rationing journey, I've questioned myself. Like one time, I looked down at the beef liver frying in my cast iron pan, and it was stinking up my kitchen, and I thought, wow, what the heck am I doing? How did I get here? And then I remember my love for these ration recipes and how just sometimes you have to take a little risk to go somewhere great. I have had some pretty interesting adventures with wartime rationing and meat recipes. So I have mixed feelings about the topic. But in the 1940s, Americans really loved their meat. So when meat rationing was instituted, it was a hardship, I think, for a lot of Americans to have to switch their thinking, switch their cooking habits and what was available. But first of all, we need to figure out, where did all the meat go? Well, first of all, I came across in a newspaper article talking about how in July of 1943, the military requirements were 45% of the available butchered meat, and that's before it ever reached civilian markets. They also required the best cuts. So the military received all the best cuts of meat and 45% of what was available in the market. So that's a lot. And I think that right there, that gives a good idea of why there was a shortage of meat and why what was left was so expensive. Now, keep in mind, this 45% that the military required, it was just a snapshot in time. This was just July 1943 and the military's needs then. These needs did fluctuate during the war. So that freed up a lot of meat for the civilians now and then. And depending also on how good the pork harvest was or the beef harvest was, that also affected how much meat was available in the marketplace after the military took their required meat needs. So the military used their meat to feed the troops And that included the meat that went into K rations for soldiers out in the field. And then it also fed injured soldiers. Some of the meat also went to feed our allies. And then the rest was, for civilians. I should also mention here for restaurants as well. March 29th, 1943 marked the beginning of meat rationing, along with fats, cheeses, and processed foods, canned foods. What's really interesting that I found in these newspaper articles is the week before rationing started, there was a run on stores and the meat was cleaned out. It's like butcher shops, and there's just all the meat was gone because shoppers made a rush to buy as much meat as they could before rationing started. This kind of sounds familiar, don't you think? Anyway, so there's that. So there's that run on the grocery stores for meat. And so when rationing began March 29th, the same thing happened. So any meat that was in the stores again was cleaned out. So housewives were taking their entire points that was available to them for the first week or two and spending all their points on meat. This was a problem because their red points not only purchased meat, but it could also purchase cheeses and fats like butter or margarine or shortening. So by using all of their red points for the meat, then they were left with no points to buy the other things they might need, like butter or cheese. There was such a concern about how much meat was being purchased that there were health statements put out saying, your refrigerator can't keep fresh meat fresh for that long. Like you can't store that much fresh meat. So be very careful about it going bad. And there was just a lot of confusion, not just about, how much meat they should be buying all at once or whatever, but there was also confusion about how the ration stamps worked. A simple way of explaining how the stamps worked is that there were stamps labeled A, B, C, D, and E, red stamps. That was the ration currency for the month of April, with a different letter becoming valid each week, but all stamps remaining valid until April 30th. But the confusion was so great about how this worked that people were coming into the butcher shop to get meat, and they were tearing out too many A stamps. Some cases they were tearing out B and C stamps when only the A stamps were valid, and the butchers were taking them, also not understanding exactly how the system worked. And it was just a big mix-up. So in the newspaper, they were saying, if this is something that you did, you need to go back to your butcher and make it right. You need to get the correct stamps turned in, and he'll give you the correct stamps back, and just to sort out this huge mess. There was even this hilarious story of this woman came into the grocery store in the morning and she bought some cheese and some lard. That particular store didn't have any meat. So she gave them the red stamps and then walked out. So they stopped her and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, you didn't pay for that. We also need to have money." And she got really mad. She said she didn't have to pay money for things when she gave stamps for them. And to prove it, she called in a cop to make them stop bothering her. So, just so much confusion. But they eventually sorted it out. They got used to the system, and grocers and butchers got used to the system. It was a steep learning curve for a lot of people, which is to be expected, really. I mean, it is a little bit complicated even now, like trying to explain it, trying to learn about it. It's kind of, it can be headache inducing. Another aspect that was confusing was that before rationing started for the meats and everything else, there were estimates made of approximately how much meat butter, lard, etc., that people would be allowed under the point rationing system. One article in the Atlanta Constitution dated March 30th, 1943, explained it really well. They quote somebody saying, "I thought we were supposed to get 2 pounds of meat per week per person. How can we get that and get any butter?" And that was a typical question that people had. How much lard am I allowed each week? How much cheese? And this is confusing because, like, if we look at British rationing, they were given like a specific portion was guaranteed per person for a certain period of time of specific things. But it wasn't really the same way in American rationing. So the article goes on to explain, quote, "It should be explained that there are no set allotments per week for any of the newly rationed foods, but the purchase of such foods works very much in the same way as blue stamp rationing. You are allowed 16 points per week, and these points may be spent interchangeably for meat, butter, lard, cheese, canned fish, salad oil, etc." Close quote. So that makes it a little more sense when it's explained that way. They're just allowed 16 points, red stamps, and you can use those however you want. Just don't go spending them all in one place, I guess is one way to say it. And I found these articles all in the Atlanta Constitution, so a Georgia newspaper. There were just some really great articles in this particular newspaper. And I think this is a good example for what was probably happening all around the country. There was just that initial confusion, how things worked, even though I think the newspapers did a fairly good job of prepping people for how things were going to work. Even in magazines, like I found a great article about meat rationing in Life magazine that explained about meats. So there was some preparation, but I think when any new system is introduced, there's just some confusion. Now we need to talk about what was rationed. I think this gets confusing now. Like when we try to study it, if you try to look online, it's very hard to pinpoint exactly what was rationed for Americans. According to this amazing article in the Birmingham News, dated March 21st, 1943, it gives a rundown of all the things that will be rationed and things that will not be rationed. And I obtained special permission to post this picture on my blog of this full spread of this page in the newspaper because it contains the most fabulous pictures that I've ever seen in a newspaper. And it has so much information about this rationing. When I found this, I thought, wow, I've hit the jackpot. I've got to share this with my listeners. So I really encourage you to go to my blog, victorykitchenpodcast.com, after you listen to this and take a look because it's really something you shouldn't miss. All right, so according to this article, this is what was rationed. All fresh, frozen, smoked, or cured beef, veal, lamb, and pork. All meat or meat products in tin or glass containers. All dried meats. Quote-unquote variety meats, including tongues, brains, hearts, liver, sweetbreads, and kidneys. Bouillon cubes and beef extracts and similar concentrates. All dry, semi-dry, and fresh smoked and cooked sausage, including salami, pork sausage, baked loaves, wieners, scrapple, souse, I don't know if I'm saying that right, hopefully I am, head cheese, and others. And if you don't know what head cheese is, it's the little pieces of meat from an animal's face that's removed and congealed kind of with some gelatin, I think, in a loaf. All right, then suet, cod, and other fats, all fish, shellfish, and fish products in hermetically sealed containers. So all those meats and meat products were rationed. These are the things that were not rationed: fresh, frozen, smoked, salt, and pickled fish. Fish in containers not hermetically sealed. All poultry and game, whether frozen, fresh, or in tin or glasses. And then also I found another reference somewhere else that said mincemeat. So I think this is very important to point out. Chicken was not rationed for Americans. This is a huge confusion, I think, because in England, chicken was rationed, and so were eggs. And there's a lot of information out there about that. And so when anyone searches like rationing, that usually comes up. So I just want to make it clear that for Americans, chicken was not rationed, neither was turkey or other game birds. Or fish for that matter, actually. Fish was rationed in England as well, but not in America. Another topic regarding meat rationing is about the farmers. The farmers, they sometimes sold directly from their farms the meat that they butchered. So it wasn't always at a butcher shop that people would go to purchase their meat. But with the rationing of meat, things had to change for them. They were urged to economize their use of home-produced foods for their own consumption and to limit their store-bought foods strictly to those not produced at home. So a farmer whose wife makes her own butter, for instance, they're asked to not go to the store and purchase butter. And if they butcher hogs or some beef, they're asked to remove those stamps from their books, equal in point value to any of the rationed foods, including meat produced at home. And then if a housewife buys her butter or meat from a nearby farmer, she must turn over the proper number of points, and then he must in turn surrender those points to the OPA. There was also made mention that farmers who were used to giving meat to family or friends or neighbors as gifts, that they had to stop that practice during the war. So no more country hams from Grandpa's farm until after the war was over. I found this really interesting. I hadn't thought about that aspect, but gifting meat could be seen as unfair because of you have that resource and others are able to take advantage of that, but not everyone. So I found that very interesting. But farmers could still sell meat. They just had to make sure that proper ration points were exchanged for the weight and amount of meat that they were selling. Now, one aspect of meat rationing I had not taken into consideration was a government meat conspiracy. I know, that sounds really mysterious, doesn't it? Well, I guess if you think of it this way, how did they get Americans to incorporate organ meats into their menus rather than their standard selections like steak, sausages, and bacon, or at least in addition to those things? I found this online article in The Atlantic by Carrie Rom, and they say that in 1940, at the behest of the Department of Defense, the National Research Council assembled a team of the country's leading social scientists to create the Committee on Food Habits. Its mission was twofold. First, they needed to launch an in-depth study of America's eating habits. Who in a household decided what would be served? What made a meal a meal? What was the ideal balance of familiarity versus novelty? And second, once it understood the factors that influenced those answers, the committee needed to change them in ways that benefited the war effort. So the government needed to figure out a way to incorporate these meats that were usually considered in the general American consciousness to be waste meat, not useful to them, or they consider them like poor people food. So they needed to change that to make use of this resource that was high in nutrition and not as in demand, and the military didn't need it, so it was a good asset. So in 1940, Margaret Mead, who was an anthropologist, and a German-born psychologist by the name of Kurt Lewin, were tasked with studying Americans' eating habits. I found this paper written by Brian Wansink entitled Lost Food Acceptance Lessons from World War II. And he says that, quote, prior to 1942, the focus on changing eating habits had reflected a stimulus response model of propaganda and nutritional education. In contrast, Lewin and Mead believed we first needed to reduce consumption barriers before people could effectively be encouraged to change their eating habits. That is, before giving people nutritional or patriotic reasons why they should say yes to eating liver, it was important to first remove the reasons they would say no. Without removing barriers to consumption, promotional incentives would be wasted, close quote. So Ms. Mead and Mr. Lewin studied Americans' eating habits. And while it was originally thought husbands controlled what food made it to the table due to their preferences, what they found in their studies was that it was the person doing the planning, shopping, and cooking, which usually meant the housewife, who determined what was put on the table to eat, despite the husband's preference. And this idea was confirmed after a national survey showed that husbands and children frequently ate what was prepared for them and only objected when the meals got too weird or different. So through this, they determined that their efforts to change eating habits should be aimed at the housewife, the one who selected, purchased, prepared, and served the food. Brian Wansink also said, quote, foods also become more of a social norm when they are aligned with the patriotic obligation to, quote, do one's part for the war effort. As such, they soon became foods that patriots ate, not necessarily foods that poor people ate. The war effort helped make organ meats more socially acceptable. Consuming organ meats was one way of showing support for the war effort on the home front. As a result, there was a suspension of grumbling, because to do so would be to minimize the greater sacrifices being made by others, close quote. So I find that really interesting because, we all know about the patriotic aspect and the propaganda behind what foods to eat because we see the posters. Anytime you do an online search or go to museums, you see these amazing wartime propaganda posters about food. But what we maybe don't realize is the subconscious aspect. Where did they go from I don't eat liver to, liver is served once a week in our household. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't just magically happen, or it just wasn't always there. It was something that had to be taught to the American people, and they did that during the war. So to help make that happen, they also had to provide housewives with ways in which to cook the organ meats that was familiar and appetizing. And they had to do it in incremental ways by encouraging housewives to just try organ meats for variety and to incorporate them into their meal planning now and then. Butchers and reporters for newspapers were encouraged to call organ meats quote unquote variety meats to help remove some of the stigma. It helped that variety meats were sold for less ration points than standard cuts of meat. And I've also found this term used extensively in my wartime cookbooks that I've collected. Most of the time, I think that is what they're referred to as variety meats. And if you think about it, the term variety meats just makes it sound like, wow, more variety. But when you say organ meats, there's an immediate gut response. If you've never had them, or I didn't grow up eating organ meat, so for me it's like, ugh, that sounds disgusting. So there is that difference in even just the term being used. So one example of this is in the January 1943 Life magazine that I talked about earlier that has a great article about meats, and in this particular case, variety meats. It says, quote, for no good reason, most Americans wrinkle their noses at the idea of any of the functional organs of otherwise edible animals, yet tripe, kidneys, tongue, heart, liver, and the other variety meats shown on the following pages are not only rich in nutritive value, but when properly prepared are among the tastiest dishes known. Close quote. So I have a copy of this magazine, and the pictures in there are fantastic. There are many, many pictures of the different organ meats, and it shows the variety to which they can be applied to meals and dishes. And when I posted about this on my Instagram account, I was really excited and happy that so many people are like, oh yeah, we eat that organ meat in my house, or oh yeah, tripe is great, this served this way. And even I have learned to use chicken livers because of my ration cooking adventures. And I think those are the ones that I would turn to the most if I had to, because they're much milder than beef livers. They don't stink as much when you cook them. And you can incorporate them, mix them in with other meats. I've mixed chicken livers in with ground beef for meatloaf and served it to guests, and they thought it was great. So I don't know if I remember telling them if I had put them in there or not. Yeah, so anyway, but see, they didn't know, and it was great. I bet if any of my friends are listening to this right now, they're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm never eating at Sarah's house again. It's it's a danger in the hobby, I guess, of ration cooking. So now we need to talk about, like, after we've talked about all this meat stuff, we're going to talk about meat alternatives. And as tempting as it is to go into the Meatless Mondays thing, that really is, like, that can be a topic unto itself. So I am saving that for a different episode. So right now, I'm just going to talk about meat alternatives. In the Health for Victory Meal Planning Guide from April 1943, that is their featured article in here, is about meat alternatives and delicious ways to use them in meals. And they have what they call first-class proteins and second-class proteins. So their first-class proteins are fish, poultry, variety meats, there's that term again, milk and cheese, eggs. Their second-class proteins include legumes, dried beans, peas, lentils, peanuts/peanut butter, nuts, whole grains, the grain with nothing removed, which includes whole wheat, entire rye, old-fashioned cornmeal, natural brown rice, oatmeal, entire barley, gram flour, cracked wheat, buckwheat. And then in this really great magazine's cookbook issue, they have hints on how to make a little meat go a long way. So, in other words, how to stretch your meat ration. You can use your meat in a stew. You make a meatloaf mixed with cereal, bread, or cracker crumbs. I remember my mom doing this with oatmeal. She would add oatmeal to our meatloaf. So I thought that's how everybody made meatloaf, but apparently not. Meatballs served with veggies, meat patties combined with cereal, crumbs, or mashed potatoes. And I just tried this last night. I tried a ration recipe that was called potato burgers, and it was ground beef mixed with shredded potatoes and onions. And it was fantastic. It was so good. And it really stretched my meat that I had. They also suggest casserole dishes or meat pie, hearty soups with a meat stock base, stuffed with dressings such as stuffed beef, lamb, or veal hearts. So like stuffing a meat with stuffing. In salads with potatoes, macaroni, or mixed vegetables. You could extend it with cereal. So you combine with cornmeal or oatmeal with hamburger, for example. Serve with baked beans, salt pork, frankfurters, sausage as an example. So less meat is needed to satisfy the appetite in that way. And then you could also make it into a hash, combined with potatoes, onions, or other vegetables. Whew, there's lots of ways. And I'm sure as I've read off this list, you can think of so many dishes that you already make at home that practice these things that extend meat. I mean, there's so many ways to do it. And for those of you that are interested, I will post these images from this Health for Victory Club meal planning guide that show these interesting dishes you can use to get your protein, even if you don't have beef. Yeah, check that out on my blog. And after the break, I will be sharing the featured cookbook for today, 120 wartime meat recipes. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Today's featured cookbook is 120 Wartime Meat Recipes, published by the American Meat Institute. And this is a cute little blue cookbook that I can just hold in the palm of my hand. It's very small. This is one of the first ration cookbooks that I bought. I was early in my journey of collecting ration cookbooks, and I actually saw this one at a World War II event at the display of a woman who became a very good friend of mine. And I just poured over this little book and marveling at all the different, and I'll be honest, disgusting sounding recipes held within. But as I've gone through this book, and I've actually made a couple recipes from here, you know, I've gotten used to the idea of variety meats. It doesn't gross me out as much as it used to, except for maybe the fried pork brains. I don't know if I can. Nope. Anyway, so starting out, this cookbook has little black tabs on the side, printed onto the edges of the pages of the book. And it's divided by types of meat. So pork, beef, veal, lamb and mutton. There's a lot of those. Smoked meat and sausage. And yeah, that's the last category. And so at the front, it tells you how to find the recipes in the book. And then it also has a little introductory page that's very short called Meat and Wartime Nutrition. And it has a picture of a soldier getting, looks like a T-bone steak put into his plate. And it says, why is meat item number 1 on Uncle Sam's food shopping list? Why does the man in training get nearly a pound of meat a day? Why is meat a basic part of every Army ration, even down to pocket-sized Field Ration K? Meat, to which man always instinctively has turned, is now recognized by science and by the government as a protective food containing many of the essential nutrients which make for health, stamina, and vitality. Meat provides complete, high-quality proteins, essential B vitamins, thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, important minerals, iron, copper, phosphorus. That's it. And then on the next page, it says what the housewife can do. It has a roasting timetable. It says like little tips, use available meats, learn to prepare the cuts which are available from day to day, even though you have never served them before. All can be deliciously prepared. And the second tip, conserve in cooking. Moderate, even temperatures mean less shrinkage, less loss of food values. And then they even tell you how to braise meat properly. They tell you how to learn to make a good stew and to extend meat with other foods like cereals, vegetables, eggs, milk, and cheese, and then using meat in soup. And then they also tell you how to store meat safely and to serve it attractively. They also say vary the seasonings. This is important when meat choice is limited and you have to serve the same kind of meat over and over. And that's very true. What I found in a lot of wartime cookbooks, they don't have a lot of variety in seasoning. No, not a lot of herb suggestions or spice suggestions. So that's something either that wasn't very popular or just you had to learn it on your own. I don't know. All right. So this cookbook is full of lots of variety meat recipes like pork knuckles, braised pork liver, sweetbreads and bacon, omelet with brains, boiled veal hearts, broiled lamb liver. Yeah, so I don't know if any of those sound good to you, but mutton curry. Now that one I could maybe go for. All right, so the one that I wanted to talk about is the hot ham rolls. Now, I made these with my homeschool co-op class when I was teaching a wartime cooking class, and they were pretty popular, and I like them too. So the hot ham rolls is essentially, you have to think of it like a cinnamon roll, but savory. So you have a biscuit dough, and you take the chopped up meat, in this case ham, and after you've rolled the biscuit dough flat, you sprinkle the ham over the top, then you roll up the biscuit dough, and then you slice it to make little pinwheels, I guess you could call them, and then you bake those on a cookie sheet. And then in this recipe, they have you make a thin white sauce with parsley to sprinkle over the top, and that's poured over the hot ham rolls. When I made this and I posted it on Instagram, people were really weirded out because they thought it looked exactly like a cinnamon roll, but then I said it was a hot ham roll. They were very confused. But they are so tasty. And I tried another variation where I added cheese to the white sauce to make a cheese sauce because, cheese and ham, yum. And that was really good too. I'll be posting this recipe on my blog. And also, I have another biscuit roll recipe. That's a beef biscuit roll. That was the first one I ever made. It is from a different cookbook, but I thought, if you want a variation on the recipe, you could try it with ground beef as well. And this is a really great way to stretch your meat. If you've got not very much, like a half a pound to serve your whole family, this is a really great way to make it work in a very interesting and different way. For the beef biscuit roll, though, I would put a beef gravy over the top. Oh, that was really good. So that's what I would recommend for that recipe. This episode's featured homefront story was submitted by Kristen Hawkinson of Hearthstone Fables on Instagram. I just have to mention that she is an amazing artist, and I especially adore her illustrations of chickens. So you can check her out over on Instagram. But Kristen submitted a story about her dad, and it takes place, so she told me, Baltimore, Maryland, and Los Angeles, California. I just also have to mention that she told me that my podcast sparked this conversation with her dad. I'm asking about his experience in wartime, and that just makes me so happy. So what she says is that her dad was only about 1.5 years old when World War II ended, so he doesn't have any memories of rationing during the war, but he has some memories of the post-war adjustment after rationing. And I think that is an important part of the story of wartime rationing. Anyway, he remembers butter being hard to come by, with margarine being more common, and that margarine was white, essentially like Crisco, and separate yellow dye tablets were sold alongside it. And she says apparently the concern was over margarine being dishonestly sold as butter if it were to be dyed before sale. And we will be talking about that in another episode, butter versus margarine, but that's for a later time. Anyway, he remembers that when he was little, new fabric was also not as prevalent yet, so their mailman brought his Navy uniform for her grandmother to use. She made clothes for him out of it. New cars were also hard to come by until about 1950. Because her grandfather was an officer in the Air Force and had to travel, he had a gas ration card during the war. And I think that's making reference to regular civilians. They had an A gas ration card, and then there were other classifications, like if you had to travel more, if you're a farmer, and in this case, an officer in the Air Force, and had to travel. So he had a special ration card that got him more gas than the average Joe. All right. Well, thank you so much, Kristen, for submitting your dad's story and just his memories of post-war adjustment. Like I said before, I think that is a really important part of the wartime story. You know, how things didn't go back to normal right after the war, but that everyone was still affected for some years afterward. All right, well, that's it for today's episode. I just wanted to remind you that if you like this podcast and would like to support my work, you can go over to anchor.fm/Sarah Creviston Lee and click on the support button. Once again, remember to check out my blog, victorykitchenpodcast.com, for the supplemental material that I post for each episode, where you can see images of articles, wartime posters, and the recipes in today's featured cookbook. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.